Friends and acquaintances who are traditional Republicans of the Reaganite era try to assure me there is a gulf of difference between what Trump says and what he'll do. To put it mildly, I still have some doubts. Welcome to Silicon Curtain. Please make sure you are subscribed so you don't miss out on any of the material we feature and the fantastic guests that appear on the channel. Thank you to everybody as well who's been helping our current fundraiser, and that is to support our trip to Ukraine, where we're going to be doing extensive interviews on the ground with civic society leaders, politicians, people with experience from the front. We've got a whole bunch of fantastic people lined up, and we are going to be hiring a professional film crew so we can film this all in glorious quality and sound quality to share with the channel through February. So if you haven't helped, please do if it's within your capacity to do so. If you have already helped, thank you so much. It is incredibly, incredibly appreciated. Today, I'm joined once again by David DeBatto, who is host of the No Delusion Zone podcast. And if you're not subscribed to his channel, I strongly recommend you do so. He's a retired US Army counterintelligence special agent, geopolitical analyst, writer, and podcast. He is also an Iraq war veteran who served as team leader of a tactical human intelligence team in operations within Iraq and also a former policeman. David is considered too conservative for the progressive left, too independent-minded for the radical right, and seeks to challenge political dogma and naked self-interest of politicians. And oh my God, do we have our work cut out at the moment. David, welcome.
Thank you for having me back, Jonathan.
Let's dive in straight away. I mean, I'm not going to give you any softball questions here, but the big question is, do declining superpowers inevitably devolve into empires, especially if they retain that sense of exceptionalism, that sense of their unique role in the world? This is going to upset some people, but Russia has this. And I detect something like this in the US as well, this idea of being a unique civilization. And I fear that there's going to be a resistance to, let's say, the downgrading of the US empire. And it's going to mute into something that is, I would say, a soft power empire, into something that may obtain a far more obvious and harder edge. Is that too paranoid a way of thinking, or is this the process we're seeing unfold at the moment?
Well, I think paranoid thinking is very apropos right now. I think it's very difficult to be that optimistic. But to try to answer your question, I think there's a couple of things in play to answer your question as far as do all superpowers devolve into empires at the end of their run. I think empire or democracies that force or make their people or weave a myth about being exceptional, which many former autocracies were or devolved into: Nazi Germany, obviously the Soviet Union, and unfortunately America. American and the word exceptionalism was woven into our history since the very, very beginning. And that's a nice thing to think, that we're exceptional. I think it's very dangerous to think that we're better than anyone else, but that's kind of the way that it was made for us to believe. Certainly I did, and everybody I know when we were growing up. And I think one of the second main reasons, and we are seeing it certainly here now, and this could also be applied to all Western democracies right now in this particular era. It's when the leaders of a democracy, a strong democracy, like we are, and most of the nations of Europe, fail to be honest with their people. When they fail to tell them about the dangers that are happening all around them. When the leaders of those countries, and I mean not just the political leaders, the elected leaders, but the business leaders of those countries, really forget about democracy and really leave behind the kinds of things that made their democracies in the first place, and succumb to greed. And I've said this over and over again about what's the problem. Why hasn't NATO and the United States hammered Russia with even more sanctions? Why haven't they clamped down more? And it really comes down to greed in many cases, not in all cases. In some cases, it's just flat out cowardice and incompetence. But greed is a lot of it. Many Western elected officials, and certainly many corporate heads in the West, including the United States, have deep, deep fingers, deep relations, business relations in Russia, and they are loath to give them up no matter what. And you know this as well as I do. There are stories every day about Western companies that are either blatantly still doing business in Russia or are circumventing the sanctions in Russia and still doing business in Russia, when most people don't know that they are. Whether through the shadow fleets, whether through secondary sources and getting around the sanctions. But the fact of the matter is, if the leaders of Western democracies do not level with their people, which they're still not for the most part, except perhaps the Baltics and Eastern European countries, the people aren't going to believe what's going on. They're not going to believe they're in an existential crisis. And as I said, believing that you're exceptional, and when the truth comes out that, well, you know what, we're just like a lot of other nations, it really hits home to a lot of people, and you see the right then filling in that gap where the center or the left used to be, and that's what's going on right now in America, and it's going on throughout Western Europe as well. The far right, the fringe right, what used to be the fringe, is now going mainstream.
And, we're going to talk about Trump and talk about Musk. And of course, and this is a classic trick that we saw in the first Trump administration, which is make lots and lots of noise, make lots of distraction, keep everyone busy with stuff that actually is either exaggerated or perhaps even not important, or you create these sort of straw men. So something like the Christopher Steele document, which had the left and the center really obsessing over, Russian connections. I'm not saying they weren't there, but I think Russia was very good at creating this impression that those relationships were perhaps deeper and far more transactional than they were. And it just got everyone completely at each other's throats. In the meantime, you can conduct your kleptocratic business behind the scenes. It's a fantastically successful strategy, actually. And we see that rolling out at the moment too. But it's interesting, isn't it? We've got all this froth coming from Musk, but we perhaps have some interesting things behind the scenes as well. So this is one of these classic double barrel questions. Comment on the mechanic, as it were, of spin and managing the press and keeping everyone busy with nonsense, half-truths and lies. But behind the scenes, there are some real things going on. China is definitely another revanchist state, and it is expanding its control and influence around the world in obviously a far more subtle way than Russia is. Do you think behind the scenes that Trump is getting all sorts of briefings about the threat, not just from Russia, but actually from China? Because I understand that Biden, even though he was sort of dragged into focusing on Ukraine, I always got the impression it was kind of half-hearted. And the real obsession was with China. And this is a commonality that you have in both of these administrations, which kind of means there's probably a lot of briefing behind the scenes going on around that issue.
Well, no doubt about it. And I've spoken about this before. The people that work around Trump himself and his advisors and minions and the MAGA crew, have always viewed China as far more a threat to America than Russia. And I agree. China is by far the most serious long-term threat to the security of the West. There's no question about that. However, they've done that by obscuring or ignoring the short-term, the immediate threat that Russia poses to the West, including the United States. And I think part of that, or a lot of that obsession right now is going to play out in the second Trump administration. Those advisors who are single-mindedly focused on China, and to be honest with you, are somewhat sympathetic to the Kremlin and Putin, are going to force Trump to focus solely on China. And I believe, unfortunately, give too many concessions to the Kremlin when it comes to the upcoming, how shall I say, negotiations about the war in Ukraine. So, yes, I think you're right. Look, we've said this off air before. Trump has no agenda. He has no ideology. He speaks off the cuff. He's a transactional type of a person. I'll pay for this, and if you don't pay me, I'll blackmail you or do something to get it anyway. He looks at the entire world as a piggy bank, as a mafia don, just waiting for a mark to be plucked. And that's what's going on. But the people around him, as you alluded to, do have some brains, some of them. And they are mostly focused on China. Their eyes are off the prize with Russia, with few exceptions, and we can talk about some of those, including General Kellogg, who we spoke about briefly off air. And they're going to focus on China. China is a legitimate, long-term, serious national security threat to the United States and the Western world of democracies. But right now, it's Russia. And if we don't deal with Russia in a very, very serious and overwhelming way, meaning we need to support Ukraine, they need to win the war. They need to be part of any negotiations whenever they happen for settling this war in Ukraine. Our national security is gravely at risk, and I fear that that's a very real possibility.
And then we'll come to NATO in a minute, because I think that's kind of an important follow-on to look at Trump's worldview. But if we stick with China, I've been having conversations with Jerry Hendricks. I hope to have more of those again soon. And I think it's kind of interesting. What we see is China over the last decade or so rolling out this Belt and Road Initiative, which we've always come to see as a complement to the global international trade routes, because you'd think, well, why wouldn't it be? You have the overland route, you have the sea route. The sea route is incredibly commercially competitive, drives down costs because the sort of low unit cost of transporting by sea. And when you have free trade policy around the world supported by US naval might, it's rather a good system, rather cost effective for business, despite the sort of cost of maintaining those platforms and that navy capability to the US. Once that starts to get challenged, then business costs are going to rise significantly. There will be a huge logistics margin placed on trade, and certainly can only be described as free trade. Is it possible that Trump is being briefed that China is not even looking to, but already using proxies, allies, and other authoritarian entities to disrupt, if not to destroy, this concept of free trade? And this is perhaps where all these conversations about opening up a northern trade route, Greenland, etc., Canada, they're actually a strategic source to the kind of lunacy that we are seeing unfold in the information sphere.
It's a good question, but keep in mind, Trump rarely attends briefings. If he does attend briefings, he draws. He doesn't really look. He demands that the very comprehensive written briefings be put in cartoon form, and I'm not exaggerating. Ask John Bolton about this. So does he get briefings about this? Absolutely. Is he briefed about exactly what you just said? The initiatives by China, which are essentially soft power initiatives all around the world? Yes, he absolutely is. Does he comprehend them in some kind of feral way? I'm sure he does. He may, if he comprehends what's being said at all, see this again as another opportunity to influence, to blackmail, to threaten those countries that are having dams and bridges and highways and dams built by China. Not that he really understands what the long-term implications of them are, which gets back to what you were talking about Greenland. Yes, he was told about the mineral wealth, about the Arctic routes, the sea trade, and so forth and so on. Does he really get that? On some basic level, he does. Yeah, it's all about money and it's all about power. And that he thinks, well, we need to control this. We don't like China. China bad. We good. We can make money. And so he thinks about blackmailing or threatening China, or actually Denmark in this case. The same thing with Mexico and the drug trade. The same thing with Canada and the immigration problems there. And so, no, he speaks off the cuff. And if I sound like I'm really denigrating Trump and not giving him any credit at all, it's because I'm denigrating Trump and I'm not going to give him any credit at all. The man is a moron. I'm sorry, he is a moron. And he's very, very, very dangerous, Jonathan. He really, really is. He's surrounded by much smarter people, which is far more dangerous for the United States and the Western world, because some of them do know what they're talking about, but they are at least as evil as he is. Segue to Elon Musk or almost any of his picks for the board, his nominations for the most sensitive positions in our government. So No, he gets it on some level, but not from an intelligence briefing where he knows the long term implications, strategic thinking, or anything else. He thinks in good, bad, money, and really that's about it.
We'll come on to NATO in a minute because it's most likely that he looks at NATO as a protection racket. Certainly, if you look back at all his references to NATO, he doesn't understand the core principles of it. I think his mind goes to, well, if we're paying this much for it, what are we getting out? And he thinks very much in transactional financial terms, not in the sort of security that comes from it. In that respect, he seems to be rather Putin-like in his worldview. That worldview that is that it's a vicious dog-eat-dog world. It's a world of scarcity, so you have to grab what you can. And there's always somebody there who's going to either steal it off you or get there first. So it's a very, I would say, sort of extractive mindset rather than a sort of if you look back in the industrial era where we started to create a mindset that actually you can get beyond just looking at wealth as something that is a factor of your population size or what you can dig out of the ground or grow in a particular annual harvest. You can actually you can free yourself from that by creating wealth. And in the last century, it came to be creating ideas and intellectual property. So you have a mindset of more abundance. You have a win-win mindset. But he seems to have the kind of win-lose, very extractive, very. It's the kind of mindset that actually the most of humanity has probably had for most of its existence, or at least since we decided to become farmers and so on. It's dangerous in the current climate because if you translate that into a new American empire, as it were, they may be saying, look, hang on a second, Russia's doing it in Central Africa, China's doing it all around the world. Well, if we don't do it too, we're going to be relegated to an ex-superpower and we'll be on the periphery of this sort of resources grab, which is inevitable, in their terms.
Well, Jonathan, let's get back for a second. I'll answer that question by going back to your previous question. If Trump's advisors think by taking their minds off of Russia right now, conceding Ukraine, for example, to Russia and just concentrating on China, they're nuts. What do you think China is going to say and do if they see us, the United States, the alleged former guarantor of democracies, abandon a fledgling democracy, arguably the most promising democracy right now in the Western world? Do you think they're going to take that as a sign of strength, of strategic thinking? No, they're going to take that as a sign of weakness. And we are really going to have to confront China, perhaps, or maybe, probably, militarily in the very near future. What do you think that's going to mean for Taiwan? We gave up Ukraine, but we're going to fight for Taiwan? I don't think so. Yes, Trump may say we will. Biden said we will, but we could talk about Biden later. That's another story. This is just insane. We give up on Ukraine. We fail to successfully confront the Kremlin. We are going to have to militarily confront China. And anybody in the military, the intelligence, knows that, including the people on Trump's staff. So why they're doing this is beyond me, some of them. Why Trump's doing it, we just talked about. It's all transactional. He doesn't think past now. It's kind of like a 2-year-old that doesn't have their entire brain formed yet, the cerebellum. They only think about today, now. There's no past and there's no future. It's just now. He thinks about now, and that's very unfortunate for the United States and the Western world of democracies.
There's an interesting article by Anne Applebaum. Again, that's a writer and analyst who's going to trigger some people, certainly I'd say on the extreme right. They actually loathe her. But she's talking about it very much in those terms. She's saying, she doesn't say explicitly he lives in the now, but she's saying that we're living in a new era of oligarchs and indeed people like Trump and so on who have never had to engage with reality. So actually, we're judging them based on a point of view of the sort of construct of reality that we've got, and we're critiquing them based on that. But that's to give them too much credit. They're living in an absolute fantasy, they're living in a fictionalized world. So this kind of reality-based critique doesn't really work when you apply it to them. It's why we see more traditional politicians who lie, get found out, and feel they have to apologize. That's because they have one foot in their fantasy, but they also have one foot in reality. They cannot live in this totally fantastical. But Trump, he'll lie 1,000 times a day, and he feels no compunction to apologize. I get the impression that from moment to moment he'll believe the story that he inhabits. So it is actually quite convincing. But where does that lead? Someone who lives almost entirely in this fictional world they create day to day. I mean, what are the implications for that?
Jonathan, you've hit it right on the head. He has spent, and the Republican Party has spent now several years convincing the voting public in America, at least 50% of them, or at least however, 30 to 50%, depending on how you want to break it down, that voted for him not to believe in reality. Exactly what you're talking about. He doesn't live in reality. The oligarchs don't live in reality. They're up on Mount Olympus. They don't live the same world or in the same world as the rest of us. Either does Trump. He has spent an ungodly amount of time and effort convincing the American public, or enough of them also, to disregard reality. There's been any number of shows about that. You've done some, I've done some, I've written about it. Reality itself is in question right now. So when you have a sizable number of your citizens, enough to vote this lunatic into office, who actually question reality, right and wrong, where there really is no right and wrong. It's whatever their leader tells you is right or wrong. Well, it's ripe for anything to happen. And that's exactly the type of atmosphere that we're living in right now. That whatever Trump tells at least a sizable, if not a majority, of the American public, that black is white, up is down, they're going to believe it. And if that sounds simplistic, then folks, you haven't been paying attention, at least not to this country, my country, because a sizable part of the population does not believe in reality. They believe in absolutely anything that Donald Trump tells them. And they're going to believe, unfortunately, a lot of what the lunatics, the wingnuts that he is going to appoint to his cabinet tell us about everything from vaccines to national defense to the climate, you name it. So, Jonathan, this is an extremely interesting but very, very dangerous time.
And from other conversations I've had, and we did an interesting one about the end of globalization. And I think chaos usually comes when either elites or empires are in a process of declining and have significant issues. And then we have to, we look at Russia, which is clearly coming to the end of an imperial phase. What the next transition point might look like is for anyone to guess, unfortunately. But there you have that entity, that historical entity, which is in a slow motion car crash coming towards the end of it before it's actually figured out how to define, the next phase of the post-imperial phase. And all of the philosophies coming out of Russia, half-baked though they are, from Dugin and the Z Patriots and so on, they're all clinging to empire. They're all trying to create a new set of clothes for that empire to inhabit. You have the US, which is also creating almost a sort of post-imperial fiction for itself, with Trump talking about Canada, Greenland, etc. But there's another elephant in the room which barely goes noticed, and that is that we've had the first attempt, perhaps in history, to create a pan-global empire, which was globalization, a very non-traditional empire where you have a trading network across the world supported by imperfect, but nonetheless an attempt at global institutions and rulemaking. That is a process which almost unnoticed by many people is really is beyond the point of collapse and disappearing. So I think that's also the backdrop where we're seeing these other struggles emerge, is the unwinding of the globalization phase, which really was sort of constructed from the Second World War onwards.
Well, again, you've hit the nail on the head, at least in this country, and I believe this is true for the Western world. Many, many tens, if not hundreds of millions of people are scared to death of modernity. They are scared to death that they've been left behind, that the globalization that you've referred to is the enemy. And some of their leaders, the far right leaders, the lunatics like Trump and the current day Republican Party in America, have reinforced that view that the future is scary. It's the enemy. It's going to put you out of a job. It's going to take food out of your mouths. It's going to make you homeless. We have to step back to the good old days where, at least in America, America was first. We were the only superpower, and where things were good. At least if you were a white male, they were great. And we have to make them great again. And so people are illegitimately, in my opinion, scared of moving forward. They hate globalization. So in America, at least, part of the actions that are being espoused here, whether it's the mass deportation, the insane tariffs that Trump wants to impose on China and Canada and Mexico and anybody else he can, is really going to disrupt that global economic network. But let me say something, Jonathan. I'll ask you what you think. China's not going to like that. China really wants to keep the status quo right now because their economy, even though it's growing, has got some major problems. They want to keep this globalization going because that's going to benefit them. If the global network, the economic network, which, as you rightfully said, was established after World War II, is disrupted or destroyed in a worst case scenario, they will lose as much, if not more, than most other nations. So I don't think they're going to like that. They're going to take a dim view of the West. Well, I'll say America anyway, trying to disrupt or destroy that. What do you think about that angle? The Chinese defending the global order over what America and Trump is trying to do.
I think they won't want to dismantle certainly sort of maritime networks entirely, but they may want to do the equivalent of, when roads emerged or private companies building roads, in Europe and so on, you'd have tolls. I think they want to start imposing tolls. They want to start imposing a higher price on the network, but they don't want to dismantle it completely because, as you say, their economy is built on value add to raw materials, not on extracting and selling raw materials. In that, they're fundamentally different from Russia. Russia is the nihilist, as it were. Joseph Lindsley calls, Russia the school shooter of nations. I had a chat with someone last week, and this is probably I'm going to do an episode on this, called Russia the Dalek of nations. It literally wants to destroy anything that doesn't look like itself because it doesn't really understand modernity and it is trying to sort of flee from it. And it sees modernity as an intrinsic threat to its vertical power structure. I think China is a very different beast, but it wants to control it. It doesn't want to be an equal hegemon with the Western countries. It doesn't want to play the game by the rules. It wants to subvert those rules. But I doubt whether it will want to do it through direct military confrontation, at least not at this point in its history. So for those who are sort of, going on about Russia and China as if they're equal threats, I think they're very different flavors of threat. China, people like this, is intrinsically perhaps more rational as a player, more strategic than Russia is. And it's certainly not nihilistic, I would say.
Well, no, and I agree with you. And for those who say that Russia takes the long view, I think in reverse, yes, they can look back to 800 plus year history, but in terms of taking the long view for the future, I think we don't need to look any further than February of 2022. They're looking at the right now and the re-future. They want to resurrect the Russian Empire, the Soviet Union, and probably the Russian Empire. They don't want to wait. Whereas China, because they actually have a much, much longer history, does take the long view. And they do not want a military confrontation right now. It really wouldn't do them any good. They are business people. They want to keep the interconnectedness in the world interconnected. They don't want it disrupted or destroyed. For the reasons that you're talking about, Russia actually apparently doesn't give a damn. They're not totally isolated right now, but they're not in great shape. They are a pariah to various degrees. So no, they're very different threats. And I said that just a little earlier. The American defense establishment under Trump and the Republicans seems to think that Russia's not that big of a deal right now. Yeah, they're a threat, but the real threat now and in the future is going to be China. So we should take our eye off the prize of Russia, kind of give them what they want, or as Trump actually said, do whatever the hell you want with Ukraine. And focus then on China. Obviously, that's a huge mistake. Economically, it would be a catastrophe for the United States. From a national security standpoint, it would be a disaster for the United States. And China would look at that as weakness and actually take some further aggressive actions that they probably would not take if America did not throw in the towel to Putin over Ukraine.
And that very much relates to Taiwan. If the US is to expand its relationship with Greenland, there's a euphemism there. But maybe at the end of the day, this is a negotiating tactic, and what will end up is that US will have a significantly increased presence there. But without sort of completely swallowing it as a sovereign entity. I mean, that may be where it ends up. It may not. I know there's a lot of normalization taking place. But essentially, whatever form that process takes, China might turn around and go like, do you know what? How can you on any kind of grounds, including moral grounds, judge us for taking Taiwan? Then we're in an interesting position because so much of the world's advanced chip making capability is based in Taiwan. So this isn't just a scrabble for resources such as hydrocarbons and so on. It's a scrabble for the resources of the future, which is the microchips that are going to be powering, the computer industry, the media industry, AI, and everything in the next decade.
Well, you're absolutely right, Jonathan. But let's just talk about for a moment the tactics that Trump has so far used, and he's not even in office yet. There's another week to go, and he's threatening militarily some of our allies, Denmark, for God's sake. I mean, look. I'm not saying we shouldn't talk about Greenland. It does have strategic value. Everybody that knows anything about this knows that that's the case, but there are ways to negotiate, especially with allies. And at the point of a gun, especially in public, is not the way to do it. All that's doing is souring our relationships. Sure, Denmark may sit down and talk to us now where they might not have before. NATO may sit down with us and try to soften their hesitation about expanding their defense budgets and so forth. But I'm telling you, it's left a really bad taste in their mouth. This is going to sour, if not destroy, some relationships between Western allies and the United States that have taken 80 years to build. This is not the way to do it. It's the way that, like we said, a mafia don does it. This is outrageous. It's insane. There's nothing good that's going to come out of this. Trump, negotiated with these countries anyway about all of these things using the proper diplomatic channels and not washing our laundry in public and especially threatening them. I mean, again, this is just insane. This is the sign of a lunatic. And we now have a lunatic shortly going to be the president of the United States, advised by a group of people who are at least as mentally deranged as he is, and I can't stress that enough, that are going to be advising him. And I'm going to continue to say that for the next 4 years. God forbid he lasts that long.
And we have to turn to Musk as well, because Musk may be a bit of an outlier here. He seems to be saying things which are just off the scale bonkers. Which almost, this may be the informational purpose, which almost makes some of Trump's lunacy look, I won't say normal, but not quite so nuts. Musk is insulting people. He's insulting democratic elected governments. He is openly supporting, retweeting, siding with the most extreme elements. There's the neo-Nazi faction in Germany, who actually are now, I think, the second or third most popular faction in the parliament. They're going to take considerable number of seats, even if they don't win. So he's retweeting literal neo-Nazi movements. He's openly supporting. He sent some messages in support of Andrew Tate, who's again, he's very litigious, so people can look him up. There's some really, really bad stuff on him, alleged out there, and court cases, which are either ongoing or you can see the record out there. But to even associate yourself with this, an individual like that is extremely strange and unpleasant. There was also an article over the weekend in actually a very conservative newspaper alleging that Musk has a relationship with Dominic Cummings, who was one of the architects of Brexit. Again, I'm told he's an extremely litigious individual. So I'll just point to the article and say to people, look it up. See what's being said there by newspapers that actually have lawyers who can protect them in that event. But these are not just people who are extreme in their views. They explicitly want to tear down the traditional way of doing things, consensus politics, all the management structures that govern the administration of the US and the UK. They want to literally rip apart the mechanisms of the state, which, even though they may be inefficient, even though there may be lots of problems, they don't want to reform the current systems. They want to tear them down. There's something extremely nihilistic about the people that Musk is amplifying on his platform. How do you read this?
I read it exactly as you do, but I also know that he and Trump are playing to their base. And right now, and I'll speak again about my country, the United States, that is the current political climate that we're in. The timid, cowardly, useless former Republican Party, the fascist party of America, is totally in with this because they are catering to the lowest common denominator, the worst of their base, who do want to burn it down. Literally, they want to take and tear down all the established institutions in this country. They literally mean that. So when someone like an Elon Musk talks about cozying up to the neo-Nazis or the farthest right lunatics that he could find, he has a sizable number of Americans that will support this because they will support anything that talks about rage and retribution and tearing down the institutions and instituting mass chaos. That is exactly where we're at. I wish, Jonathan, I didn't say that I didn't have to say that was some crazy notion of mine. But not only is there a sizable number of the American people who believe that, but the Republican Party, the MAGA Party of America, seems to be all in with that. The recent reports that I've read recently, as of even today, says that the MAGA Republicans are probably going to support and not fight against confirmation of even the most radical crazies that Trump has nominated for his cabinet positions. All of them. I can't stress how dangerous this will be, not just for America, but for the entire Western world of democracy. So Elon Musk is a nutcase. Maybe he's always been, but he's certainly one now. But so is Donald Trump. And they are two complete nuts that are a perfect marriage made in hell. And whether or not they're going to break up and have a fight, I know Steve Bannon is called Elon Musk evil. Well, that's great coming from
And a
him.
racist, which is
And a racist. Yeah, I mean,
except it's the
wow.
wrong kind of racism, right? It's not like we hate racists. It's like you've got the wrong kind of racism here, and it's not
Yeah,
not like ours.
no. And again, just, don't even listen to Steve Bannon. I mean, don't listen to any of them. So whether they're infighting or not, yes, it's interesting and it's important, and maybe some huge cracks will come out of that. I don't know. I tend to think not, because the richer they are and the more radical and crazy they are, they seem to bond and they seem to attract the attention of a sizable number, enough of the American public, that they're almost, you can't get rid of them. They're Teflon, like the Teflon Don is.
And this is something that unites all of them. It's an interesting one to look at, is that all of them can command a substantial social media audience, and the social media algorithms are driven by confrontation, driven by the most extreme passions and elements. And here you have the new oligarchy, the new robber barons, which are the sort of tech bros, they are all doing what Timothy Schneider warned about. They are all obeying in advance. They are removing their fact-checking infrastructure. They're doing not what they've been told to do by the court at Mar-a-Lago. They've been told to do what they think that court might appreciate. Jeff Bezos, obviously owner of Washington Post, has put an injunction, as it were, or editorial injunction on any cartoons that rip into Donald Trump. This is a deeply strange and scary moment to see the oligarchy moving behind the aspiring autocrats.
Well, I mean, if anybody has any questions now about somebody like myself being off the wall or crazy or exaggerating or something like that, just look at the media in America. The point that you just made, all of the biggest social media giants have taken off their or canceled their fact-checking offices. Now, anything could be said. Threats, obscenities, the worst, most vile type of language, terrorist threats can be said now because it's all freedom of speech. The rings being kissed and the knees being bowed down in Mar-a-Lago by the heads of all of the biggest media platforms in the United States is indicative of throwing in the towel. How about old Morning Joe Scarborough going down almost immediately after the election with his wife and kissing the ring in Mar-a-Lago? Joe Scarborough, one of the biggest critics of Donald Trump, calling him a Nazi for months before the election, calling him a fascist and a danger to America for months and months before the election. As soon as Donald Trump won, he went down with his wife down to Mar-a-Lago on bended knee. And mea culpa, kissed his ring, as well as all of, like you just said, Jeff Bezos and Zuckerberg,
Zuckerberg,
and
yeah.
all of them. I mean, just without having asked, like you said, they just did it in anticipation of not displeasing the new king. If that's not a sign that we have caved in, that we are becoming an authoritarian oligarchy, I don't know what is. Maybe the concentration camps that are soon to be built in the American Southwest for the mass deportations and the American military being deployed on the streets to arrest all of the enemies of the people. Maybe that'll convince some more people of what we've descended to.
And, they may well know something that we don't yet know. And if we look back at how Putin took control in Russia, one of the, if we ignore the apartment bombings and the, wiping out the Polish government, which is alleged, that's on the extreme fringe still, that allegation, but it's looking more and more plausible. But if you discount those sort of blatant FSB kind of things and provocations in Chechnya, one of the key things he did was use the oligarchs who hadn't yet fully bended the knee. They still believed they had some semi-independence, but he used them and he used the state to buy up the media holdings to shut down I was about to say propagandists, but that's not what I mean. I mean satirists. He actually, one of his first things was to shut down the satirists, shut down those who are going to be critical of him, move those out of the system, and start bending the reality you see in TV news to his control. It's a process that took several years. But what he discovered is that despite all the noise and the protestation, there are only, 5 to 10% of people working in that media who were prepared to actually leave the country and say, that's it, I'm done. The rest might have moved into lifestyle programming and out of news, or just, buckle down under the new regime and I don't believe this stuff, but it's just a job, etc. Could Scarborough see behind the scenes that this similar process is going to be taking place of the MSNBCs and other media platforms that were critical of Trump in term one? These are going to be wiped out by Trump's acolytes in term two.
Well, call me a pessimist. Call me, I don't believe in delusions, but I believe that he couldn't see anything. He or any of them. They were just cowards. They are cowards. They go whichever way the wind blows. After the election, he obviously saw that calling Donald Trump a fascist and a Nazi was probably not going to get his contract renewed at MSNBC or anywhere else. So he decided to go to Mar-a-Lago and bend the knee. Same thing with Jeff Bezos and his contracts with NASA and the military. And on and on and on and on. No, I don't think these people foresee anything, especially Zuckerberg. My God, what a chameleon. This guy's changed his political views as much as most people change their socks. So, no, I don't think they were prescient. I think they are cowards. And they never wanted to defend democracy. The reporters, I'm not talking about the reporters and the rank and file journalists. We've got some excellent journalists in America. I'm talking about the upper level, the owners and the senior management of the big media platforms in America. I believe they contributed a great deal to Joe Biden, not Joe Biden, but the Democrats losing and Trump winning by their just incompetence and cowardice of calling Trump what he is, a fascist. And just calling out all of the things he said and done. Now that he's won, they haven't really changed that much. They're now just totally in with him without being told to do that because they were the owners again, spineless before, not really, pillars of defending democracy. And now it's just blatant now that there really is a danger to them and their families. So they haven't really changed that much. Were they prescient? Do they foresee it? In my opinion, absolutely not.
We're going to pick up a lot of these themes. The next one's the last place I'm going to end on. Again, this episode is very much about, I would say, this new imperialism and this new world order that is taking shape. And we're going to be touching upon it in a lot of conversations, interviews, and Russia's role in it. And, Russia's not pulling all the strings. So there's a lot of people who choose to subscribe to that, to that worldview, and they're busy trying to construct it. The last point, though, because I think we should mention Ukraine at least once, because Ukraine is an interesting place because it's managed to get much of its oligarchic influence out of the media. It's an interesting template for the world. It's one that we should be paying a lot more attention to. But dropped into that, we had this extraordinary interview between Lex Friedman and Zelensky, and I've talked a lot about it on the channel. Those videos are done incredibly well. They've generated a lot of debate. But I wanted to make this comparison. You've got Lex Friedman on the one hand, who is, his questions are very much based on various Russian talking points. But I think that was the whole point. The whole point was for Zelensky to actually be introduced to people who've literally believe these talking points, these Russian talking points, and sort of it's the pond they swim in. And this allows a slightly alternative point of view. So I kind of get that and why they chose Lex to do it. Let's be honest, I don't think they're going to choose you or I to interview Zelensky anytime soon.
Although they should.
They certainly should, hint, hint. But you also have another extraordinary interview, which I'm going to do an episode on, and that is the one between Tucker Carlson and Alexander Dugin, one of the, I would say, architects of at least the theories that underline this new world disorder. Have you watched that? What did you make of the Lex interview? We'll probably end on this one.
Yes, I did. And I know a lot of people, maybe most, are saying that he's a Russian agent. He's a Russian plant. I don't know. I obviously he spouts a lot of Kremlin talking points. I think he's a moron. I think he's an idiot, no matter whether he's a Russian agent or not. But I think it was a good interview to have for Zelensky. For the reasons that you've talked about. I was very proud of Zelensky and how he stood up to him. A lot of his the responses, how he said it, what he said. And it was a good chance for people in the Russian-speaking audience. And as you know, Zelensky spoke some in Russian to get through to some of the Russian-speaking audience, but then the rest of it was in Ukrainian rather. And I think that was very astute of him to do that. And hopefully he got through to both audiences. Whether he's going to change anybody's mind in the Russian-speaking world, outside of those that have already left Russia, of course, those still inside of Russia, it's possible. Those that have VPNs that can actually hear the interview. So to answer your question, I think that it was a good interview. I think it was a good thing that it took place. And I'm very, very proud of how Zelensky handled it. But then again, I've been proud of much of what Zelensky said and done for the last several years.
That's where we're going to have to call an end to it for today. But I'm sure unfortunately, we'll have a lot of stuff to pick through on our next discussion. And just to let everyone know, I will be appearing on David's channel. So if you like this, or even if you hate it, watch some more of it as we sort of try to unpick the
Especially
future.
if they hate it. I want to hear about those haters.
Yes. And explain why. I mean, I think it's important to have a dialogue. Even some goes like, "This isn't true." It's like, don't just, sling insults. Say why you think it's not true. Say where you think we've got it wrong, and we'll debate it. I think that's going to be more
Absolutely.
important to do that.
Yes.
But for today, David, thank you so much.
You bet. My pleasure.